For a very long time now, you've been asking me to make a video about Titania, and I'm gonna be real, as someone who never played her all too much, I was shocked by how good she actually was. So, in this Warframe guide, I'm gonna give you an in-depth explanation on Titania with multiple, very different builds for different scenarios. Big shout out to all our beautiful channel members for your generous support, and now, let's jump right into it. But you know the drill, before we jump into the modding, let's first take a look at Titania's abilities so we're all on the same page about what she can even do. Her passive is really straightforward and not all that impressive, to be honest. You gain plus 25% bullet jump and rolling distance, giving you some more mobility, which is nice but really no rocket science. And then also, whenever you cast an ability, then you and allies within 15 meters of you will regenerate 4 health points for the next 20 seconds. One thing to note here though, this little heal does in fact trigger Archon Intensify, so in case you're playing your Titania in a way where you constantly lose health and heal it back up, then this might be a nice to know fact. Let's rather now talk about her active skills, as they tend to be quite a bit nicer, starting out with Spellbind, her first ability. This one is very straightforward but also quite useful. When you tap it, you create a little AOE at the point that you're aiming at. If you hold it, you create that AOE around yourself. Enemies in that AOE get disarmed and ragdolled at the same time, whereas allies in the AOE gain immunity to status effects for the duration of the ability. Now, all in all, I'm sure that this enemy disarming and juggling around can be quite useful here and there, but mainly the way that I like to use my Spellbind is hold to cast it onto myself and just use it for the status immunity, as it also covers knockdown and stagger, which is very convenient because that means you don't have to run primed sure-footed, because with her in specific we do need that extra slot quite a bit, as you're gonna see in the build section later in the video. Now, Spellbind also has an augment called Spellbound Harvest, and what this does is, when you manage to hit 4 or more enemies with the AOE of your Spellbind, you will instantly get 50 energy and your next ability cast has 40% ability range. In my personal opinion, Spellbound Harvest is a kind of so-so ability. On the one hand, the free energy plus increased ability range can be quite useful, but on the other hand, the question is it worth a mod slot, or do you rather rely on other means of refilling your energy, like for example Equilibrium? I personally, for my builds later, didn't use this one, but that doesn't mean it is bad, just saying that I have different preferences. Ability number 2 is called Tribute, and this has quite a lot to unpack. As you see in the bottom right corner of the screen, Tribute is one of those skills where you have multiple to switch through under the umbrella of one ability. First of all, the way it works is you tap Tribute to shuffle through the 4 abilities and then aim at an enemy and hold the ability button to actually cast it. This will knock back the enemy and create a sort of hologram that you can then pick up to activate one of the 4 corresponding buffs. Buff number 1 is called Thorns, and this is actually really great, gives you 50% damage reduction and reflects 50% of the damage taken back to the attacker. Now, this reflection is whatever, but an additional layer of 50% damage reduction? Well, sign me up for that. That's really great, making Titania much tankier. Number 2 is called Dust, and this even further helps with your survivability because it creates an aura around you that will make enemies less accurate when firing. Now, to be 100% honest here, it is kind of difficult to showcase a loss in enemy accuracy, but if you take a close look at those heavy gunners in the background, you see that their shots are kind of flying all over the place, but not really into me. Buff number 3 is called Full Moon, and this is very great if you want to play Titania as a sort of Beastmaster, because it increases companion damage by 75%, as well as increase their health and armor. However, there is a problem with that. If you also use Summoner's Wrath on your Titania, then normally Summoner's Wrath and Full Moon are supposed to stack multiplicatively, which would make the combination very darn strong. But, as the wiki says, if you first activate the Full Moon buff and then create the summon, then Full Moon will override Summoner's Wrath, making the whole thing much weaker, which is very finicky and I find it quite unfortunate. And then the final buff is called Entangle, In my opinion, it's not all that great. It will give an aura that slows enemies down by 25%. I didn't find it all too noticeable, but hey, it also doesn't hurt, so you might as well activate it. Ability number 3 is really cool too. This one is called Lantern, and it is a powerful crowd controlling ability. What happens here is you cast this at an enemy. That enemy then will become invincible for the entire duration of the skill, and it will create an AoE around that foe where every other enemy in that AoE gets completely distracted like an insect around a lantern, and they will just completely focus on the lanterned enemy, orbit around them while taking a little bit of chip damage over time. You can have up to 4 lanterns on the field at the same time, and overall, this is a very welcome skill for all those mission types where you're in a bit more of a defensive role, as it distracts enemies from attacking, for example, a defense target. However, when you combine this with its augment, Beguiling Lantern, then it'll also become a very good offensive tool, as Beguiling Lantern gives all enemies in the AoE of a lantern 100% more weapon damage vulnerability. This scales with ability strength and therefore can drastically increase your weapon damage output. And then finally, let's also talk about Razorwing, which is Titania's bread and butter, her signature ability. When you press this, the first thing that'll happen is Titania will shrink down into her little fairy form and can fly around through the level as if she's in Archwing mode. In fact, the controls are basically the same. This mode will not only make her much faster and therefore a great speedrun frame to run through mission tile sets, but also, because she's so tiny and quick, she gains a passive 50% evasion, which means whenever you get hit, there's a 50% chance that this hit will simply not count, and that is also one of the reasons why Titania is so popular among high-level play, as she doesn't rely on tanking damage, she relies on not taking damage in the first place, and she's really good at that. But that's not the only buff she gets in this form. Also, she receives a 10-meter vacuum aura, which helps her suck in nearby items. That is very useful, because you would otherwise miss a lot of pickups. Just note that Razorwing is a channeled ability, meaning all types of energy gain over time effect, like for example Energy Siphon or Energy Nexus, do not work at all while you're in this form, meaning you gotta rely on stuff like Equilibrium or maybe also Arcane Energize. Now, while Titania is in her Razorwing form, she also gains access to her 2 exalted weapons, the Diwata sword and the Dex Pixia dual pistols, and we're gonna talk more about them in a second. Just one very important thing to note here, in Razorwing form, you have to use these 2 weapons. It is not possible to pull out any of your regular ones. And as if all of that is not enough yet, there is a third big mechanic with the Razorwing, and that would be the Razor Flies. These are tiny little flies that Titania summons while she is in her Razorwing form, and those flies will go out and automatically attack enemies on the field. Their damage is pretty pathetic, so I wouldn't recommend building for that, but they are still a great utility tool, as you can also see in the background. Simply by distracting all the enemies around you, I can just safely hover here in the air and no enemy even thinks about aiming at me because they're much too distracted by my swarm of razor flies. Add to that the effect that Titania gains evasion on top, and you start to see that it is really difficult to be shot out of the air when playing Titania. And finally, Razorwing has not one, but actually 2 augments called Razorwing Blitz and Ironclad Flight. Let's start out with Ironclad Flight. This is a bit of a weird one in my opinion. What this does is, it gives you 40% damage reduction while airborne, kinda reminding me of another mod. However, in contrast to Aviator, which just flat out gives you the 40%, Ironclad Flight, if used, will take away that 10-meter vacuum feature while you're in Razorwing, and I think that actually hurts quite a bit, so I can't really imagine why you would use Ironclad Flight in the Exilus over Aviator. So let's rather talk about the more useful augment, that will be Razorwing Blitz, and this is very cool because it increases your fire rate as well as your movement speed by 25%, stacking up to 4 times, so 100%, whenever you cast an ability. This not only stacks really high, but it also scales with ability strength, meaning you can get some incredibly filthy speed and fire rate out of this. In fact, with a lot of ability strength, I would highly encourage not to use the sprint button because your Titania is gonna get completely out of control. And now like the video or your Titania will gain constant 500% movement speed. Cheers so much for your support. But now that we've talked about Razorwing as an ability, let's take a closer look at Titania's two exalted weapons that she wields while in Razorwing mode, the Diwata sword and the Dex Pixia akimbo pistols. First of all, let's start with the Diwata because this one is probably going to be the shorter one. I don't want to talk a lot about it because it is really bad. It's easily the worst exalted weapon in the entire game. When we're taking a look at the stats, we already know where the music plays because while it has some okay crit performance, the super low 10% status chance really hurts this thing. It means you can't use it for any type of status build, no melee influence because you're not going to trigger it often enough, and in general, the only real thing that you could do with this is go for a direct damage approach, something like this right here. I'm not saying it is so terrible that you can't use it, but if you ask me, just rather save the forma and do not invest in this weapon. Rather, take those forma and put them in the Dex Pixia because in contrast to the Diwata, this one is actually really darn good and it became much better with the release of Warframe 1999 last winter. See, the Dex Pixia is kind of the opposite of the Diwata, with higher status chance, but therefore the base crit chance of only 10% has always held it back a little bit. However, with the introduction of our Lord and Savior Secondary Enervate, this has drastically changed. In fact, I think the Dex Pixia is one of the best weapons in the entire game to use Secondary Enervate with because the increase in crit chance for low crit chance weapons like it makes it just so incredibly strong. As you can also see, you see a lot of yellow and even orange crits, all with a poopy base crit chance of just 10%. This arcane improves the weapon by like 2 tiers. Now, when it comes to building the weapon, first of all, this right here would be an example of a simple to put together beginner build, definitely gonna deal enough damage to get you into Steel Path. And once you are in Steel Path, of course you can build your Dex Pixia however you want, but there are 2 builds in specific that I want to showcase here, because those will be the 2 builds that I use with the Titania builds that I'm gonna showcase in a minute here. This right here is what I call the Impetus build, because what we do here is use Secondary Encumber, which makes it that whenever we deal a status effect, we have a 24% chance to trigger a second random status effect. This way, we can deal tons and tons of different status effects, which we will use in combination with Arcane Impetus on our Titania, as you'll see in just a minute in the build section. Because the Dex Pixia is an exalted weapon and therefore counts as a skill, that means all type of status effects we deal with the Dex Pixia, i.e. a lot of different ones through Secondary Encumber, will all trigger Arcane Impetus, making it very easy to get to the maximum of 13 stacks on it. For those Titania builds where you really want to buff up Arcane Impetus, this right here is a nice build to help with that. It doesn't really focus on dealing a lot of damage with the Dex Pixia, we're going mostly for a lot of status chance and also fire rate. However, you could always modify this build and add some more personal damage in case you don't want to use this as just a support weapon. So much for the Arcane Impetus support build. This build right here is the build that you want to use if you want to deal as much damage as possible with your Dex Pixia. As I previously said, we use Secondary Innovate to get tons and tons of crit chance, which usually with just 10% the weapon should not have, and the rest is basically what you expect. Hornet Strike for the base damage because we're not getting base damage from the Arcane this time, crit damage to pair up with all the crit chance coming from Secondary Innovate, Multi-Shot, Lethal Torrent for even more multi-shot and fire rate, Galvanized Shot to increase our status chance and to get some more damage on top, Anemic Agility to massively increase our fire rate because we kinda need that on the Dex Pixia. The base fire rate, as you also see right here, isn't all too impressive, but with the right buffs, you can go ham with this thing. And finally, whichever faction damage you like, and what I did here is I went for Toxin, which might seem like an odd choice, but as you're gonna see in a minute in the build section, it will all make sense, so just keep the Toxin in mind for now. Finally, I decided to also use the Exila slot, You do not have to do that. The Dex Pixia does not rely on this mod here. However, by default, the Dex Pixia is pretty unprecise, and looking at the footage in the background, I think targeting subsystem did narrow down that cone of fire quite a bit, so I decided to go with that to get more rounds in on the target. So much for all the basics, the skills, and her weapons. Before we jump into the build section right now though, I want to talk about a specialty with Titania that, in my opinion, sets her apart of many other Warframes and drastically influences my build approach in this video compared to my usual guides. Here's what I mean. Titania is a lot of things. However, one thing that she is definitely not is a big nuke room clearer. If you want to tap one button and delete all the enemies around you, if you want to have that big red crit screenshot damage, then you're going to be disappointed because Titania can't do that. But then again, on the other side, there's like a bazillion other Warframes that you could use instead, so I don't think that's much of a downside. Quite the opposite actually, because where Titania really shines is in, well, basically everything else. You want to do one of those pesky solo steel path defense missions without the target dying? Well, no problem, Titania has you covered. You're farming relics and want to get in and out of the mission as fast as possible while killing everything in your path? Titania can do that, and probably better than any other Warframe. How about high-level disruption? Well, Titania is probably one of the best frames to hunt down those demo units fast, while at the same time being practically unkillable, and there are so many other examples where Titania makes tons of mission types easy to play and much more convenient than most other Warframes could. And I think I'm only beginning to understand all of her capabilities. So, if after my build breakdown, you want to share how you use Titania and which setup you run on her, then you're more than welcome to put it in the comments down below. And with that being said, let's now dive into the builds which represent some of those very different use cases. Let's finally get to the point that you clicked on this video for, and that would be the build section, where the first thing I want to do is start out with a beginner-friendly build. I mean, Titania can be acquired just by finishing the Silver Grove quest, and that means relatively early on, which I would highly recommend because Titania is so versatile. She provides a lot of value to any new or mid-game account, as she can perform in many different scenarios. So, let's take a look at the beginner build first. This right here would be it, with a healthy mix of everything: duration, efficiency, range, and strength. In the aura, I go for aerodynamic, as it nicely fits with Titania, right? She's in the air most of the time, and this one will give you damage reduction. If you don't have aerodynamic though, or you just want to use any other aura, you can freely do that. This right here is no must, you could replace it with anything else. In the Excella slot, I went for Aviator, giving me 40% further damage reduction, making Titania much tankier. However, if you don't yet have or don't want to invest in Excella's adapter, you could always just leave it out. This right here will not break your build. Now, for the main build, we first start out with Intensify to increase our ability strength, meaning more damage with our Razorwing and the Razorwing weapons, Equilibrium for our energy economy, Stretch because we have a lot of abilities that kinda sorta revolve around range, so having a bit of range won't hurt, Flow to increase our maximum energy to 530, at least on the Prime version. I don't know if the normal version has less maximum energy, but you're gonna have enough energy with Flow, that's what I'm trying to say. Continuity and Augur Message both to increase our duration, which is very nice because Razorwing is a channeled ability, meaning the more duration and efficiency we have, the less energy per second it will cost, and this way we ensure that it is very cheap and you can basically keep it up all the time. Streamline for that aforementioned efficiency part, and then finally I went for Redirection, increasing our shields to 740. We don't go for health, we don't go for armor, because with the damage reduction that you get right here, if not you use the Excella slot, this will be enough to keep you alive throughout the entire star chart. No need to really build more into tankiness. That will be it for the beginner build. Let's now talk about all the different steel path variants that I previously mentioned. Starting out here, I want to do with the Archon Shards, as they are kind of a bit in a weird spot with Titania. As you see right here, I only used 2 so far, both of them into casting speed, which I think is very neat on her, as you're going to spam a lot of abilities, and they tend to have a bit more of a longer casting animation than I'm personally comfortable with, so that's why I shortened that down here. And the last 3 ones right here, you can really do whatever you want. You can put reds into there to increase your ability strength, your damage output and all. You can go for green ones if you want to armor strip through corrosive. Purple ones if you don't want to put equilibrium as a mod on Titania, but rather want to have the equilibrium effect through the shards. As you see, there's really a lot of different variations here, so I can't give you any one above all here. Now, the first build variation that I want to talk about here would be the what I call DPS build. This, as the name suggests, is a build that mainly focuses on dealing as much damage with your Dex Pixia pistols as possible, while at the same time taking as little damage as you can. Not necessarily the most interesting build, but if you want to run, for example, a longer survival mission, then this would be the direction that I would build her into. As a helmet ability with this build, we use Grendel's Nourish. I don't think I need to do much explaining here. It solves all the energy issues you might be facing, while at the same time giving you a weapon damage buff and applying viral, so a win-win-win situation. And this then right here would be the full build. Also here, survivability will come through enemies not hitting you in the first place, obviously, but if they do hit you, we rely solely on shield tanking with Prime Redirection and damage reduction through Aerodynamic, Aviator, as well as Adaptation. If you personally don't think you need all that much survivability, you can replace any of these mods with whatever you like, and then beyond that, we go for a lot of ability strength with Umbral Intensify, where I do want to state you could alternatively also go for Precision Intensify. Where is it? Here. The problem with that is, though, that if you go for Precision Intensify, then your Razorwings, and therefore your exalted weapons, will gain more damage, but therefore the damage buff from Nourish goes down. All in all, I'm personally more comfortable with Umbral. If you wanted to, you could also go Precision. Post-edit Blacky here, you could also use Archon Intensify, as stated at the beginning of the video, but in order to get it consistently, you do constantly have to lose health, and due to the fact that you only get hit very rarely in the first place, I just think Umbral is more consistent than Archon. Up next, we go for Equilibrium, for the energy economy, Primed Flow to increase our maximum energy to a whopping 755, and then more ability strength from Blind Rage as well as Arcane Kamisato, which is very nice on Titania because your little razor flies stack that up to its maximum basically at the blink of an eye. With Titania, I would definitely recommend this one over Mold Augmented. Finally, I go with the Razorwing Blitz Augment, mainly to massively increase the fire rate of my Dex Pixia, and that's also the reason why in the second Arcane slot I go with Arcane Pistolier, because this one gives me 102% ammo efficiency when I get a pistol headshot kill, meaning this will give the Dex Pixia infinite ammo, and this one here, so much fire rate, you can spray away absolutely everything. The DPS on this is ridiculous. Oh yeah, and finally, one thing that I completely forgot to mention is, for the ability duration, we're not going to go for Primed, we're going to go for Archon Continuity, because, and this is also the reason why I modded my Dex Pixia for Pure Toxin, since the Dex Pixia is considered an ability, as it is an exalted weapon, that means Toxin procs dealt by the Dex Pixia with Archon Continuity will also inflict Corrosive, which is very helpful for armor stripping. For this example right here, you could go with green Archon Shards in addition to ensure that you're going to full strip on just Corrosive alone with Archon Continuity. The next one that I want to showcase is a bit of a sub-variation of this. It is also a build that focuses on dealing as much damage as possible with your Dex Pixia, maybe for like a capture mission or a disruption if you want to focus purely on the demo units. However, the main things here that changes, we go for more duration to have a better energy economy on our 4, and also we swap out those two here. For the speedrun build in specific, it is very important to go for preparation, as it will max out our 755 energy at the beginning of the mission, allowing us to jump right into the mission, not waste any time by filling up the energy first. So this mod right here on Titania for a speedrun build is more important than you believe. Let's next, though, talk about something completely different. The build I'm about to show you now is a Thermal Sunder build, using, Gauss's Thermal Sunder as a helmet ability to give Titania the one thing that her base kit does not give her, and that is AOE damaging ability. Now, one thing I need to say right off the bat with this build is, it does not scale very well in Steel Path. If you wanted to use this to deal damage to Steel Path enemies, then you will have to spam your Thermal Sunder quite a bit, which can be pretty cringe on your energy economy, and generally I wouldn't recommend it. Instead, what this build really is for is stuff like relic farming, quick extermination missions against lower level enemies. If you, let's say, have a Void Fisher with an exterminate mission, then just play it in the normal version instead of Steel Path, blitz through the mission, one-hit everything left and right with your Thermal Sunder, and be done with it faster than any other Warframe could. This right here would be the full build, and as you see, it differs quite a bit from the ones we've taken a look at before. In the aura, we go for corrosive protection, reducing enemy armor so that our Thermal Sunder deals more damage to begin with, which is quite a nice synergy because Thermal Sunder deals heat damage, meaning that also reduces enemy armor and really helps with the damage. Next, we go for preparation here too, as we want to have the full energy on spawn right off the bat. But then for our energy economy, we don't go for equilibrium and rather use Prime Flow and Arcane Energize, as in my testing, when I run exterminate missions, I barely get any health drops, and therefore equilibrium didn't really help all that much. Rather go for Arcane Energize to capitalize on that occasional energy orb instead. Now, in order to deal as much damage as possible with our Thermal Sunder, we go for Transient Fortitude, not Blind Rage, as that would reduce the efficiency quite a lot and that might hurt, as well as Umbral Intensify up here, and then in the second arcane we go for Arcane Impetus, which will give us another very nice chunk of ability strength. This, by the way, would be one of those builds where you use the aforementioned Impetus build on the Dex Pixia to use that secondary encumber to generate all the status effects, which will then stack up this Arcane Impetus to give us a ton of ability strength as well as efficiency. Because we want to hit as many enemies as possible with Thermal Sunder, we go for Augur Reach as well as Stretch for the ability range. We could maybe potentially hypothetically go for Overextended, however the minus 60% ability strength does hurt quite a bit, so I kind of opted to not go for it. And lastly, and this is really important, Archon Vitality, as it will double the heat procs generated from Thermal Sunder. I have it at max rank here. You could also just use a rank 0 one. The only perk that we're interested in here is the heat damage is applied twice. The health bonus isn't important at all. And the last build on today's menu, and this is actually the most genius I think, is something that I didn't come up with myself. I actually saw it in a video from Asian Invasions from a couple months ago. I don't know if he was the one to come up with this tactic or he had it from someone else. I'm just saying this is the place where I saw it first. And what you do here is, as a helmet ability, you go for Decoy from Loki with the Damage Decoy Augment that you can see right here, which allows you to turn an enemy into a decoy to spread around multiple status effects. Now, this build is supposed to be used for defense-type missions, especially if you go solo. The interaction that we go for here is, we cast Lantern on an enemy to use that enemy as distraction for all the other enemies so that they can't attack the target or us, and then at the same time we cast our Damage Decoy on the same enemy because the Damage Decoy has a much larger aggro radius, meaning it will draw all the enemies in the room to our Lantern enemy, and then once they get close enough, the range from Lantern will also apply, further solidifying the enemy's attention on that Lantern enemy, so that it only very rarely happens that enemies either attack us or the defense target. Now, the Aura as well as Exilus don't really matter all that much here. You could go for whatever you like. Our main source of damage will be again our Razorwing with the Exalted Weapons, so what we do this time is go for Precision Intensify as our helmet ability doesn't need strength, Equilibrium as well as Prime Flow for the energy economy, Blind Rage and Arcane Impetus for the additional ability strength as well as efficiency. Right here, we're not using the Impetus build on the Dex Pixia, but rather the damage-focused one. However, we're gonna max out Arcane Impetus anyway because Damage Decoy from Loki will trigger so many status effects that it too can get Arcane Impetus easily to a constant 13 stacks. Damage Decoy Augment, as I just said, has to happen. Stretch for a bit more range. Archon Continuity for the Toxin interaction that I mentioned before. And lastly, I went for Beguiling Lantern, the augment for our Lantern right here, That makes it that enemies affected by the Lantern's rage will get a ton more damage vulnerability. This will be a great damage boost, and it's nice because in a defense mission you're stationary anyway, so you don't have to constantly recast Lantern. You just set it up once and benefit from the bonus. Lastly, also here, we'll go for Arcane Pistolier to give our Dex Pixia infinite ammo so we can spray away at our heart's content. I'm able to easily make it through the entire defense mission without the defense target even losing its full shield. And if you want a list of the best Warframes 2025, then don't miss this video right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nostlinux Gaming, Turtlepeer, Underkane02, Skylar Bowser, Mihawk, Phil the Meme, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morizaki, Shadow Lockhart, Trollo Loxon, Antares, Pate Crusader, Boomia1, Mr. Games Plays, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.